Hello, I'm Howard Walper, CEO of Americas for Commodities People. As you all know, weather has become a critical component in planning, operation, and risk management of energy systems. So I'm really pleased to introduce my guest today, Rob Cirincione, CEO of Sunairio. Rob, welcome.
Thanks, Howard. Good to be here.
Great to have you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about what your company does?
Sure. So I am trained as an engineer, but never really worked as an engineer. Spent the bulk of my career working as a power and gas trader. Spent a long time working at Constellation. Then I worked at a company called Boston Energy Trading and Marketing. So about 12 years between those two companies, traded pretty much everything power and gas in the Eastern Interconnect and ERCOT, and then left a few years ago to start this business. The reason I did primarily is that I felt like my job got really hard, and it got really hard because of things, trends related to what you just said, having to do with being able to anticipate weather variability, and its impact on the grid and energy markets. And so broadly, what Sunairio does is translate weather and climate risk to grid risk, specifically for the power sector and for power markets participants.
Wonderful. So, well, let's dive right into some of these issues. You mentioned that more and more you're becoming frustrated. Power markets are increasingly driven by extreme events and volatility. What's really changed in the market that makes this so challenging for traders today?
Right. So let's first start with what hasn't changed. Weather
Okay.
has always been sort of the primary driver of grid outcomes. Now, the trends though that have made this even more important and more complicated, sort of the confluence of two things. So number one, we're increasing the amount of weather-based risk on the grid. And that's due to increasing penetration of renewables, wind and solar, which are basically just weather-based resources. At the same time as the underlying weather that drives all of this variability is increasingly getting more difficult to predict. I mean, look at what's just happening in the West, right? Absolutely, crazy extreme heat. And we're seeing this, not just in the, with heat events. We're still seeing, very extreme, cold snaps that surprise us, or surprise many people in the winter. And it's more than that, though. It's trying to understand, how is that affecting load at the same time as the weather that drives wind and solar is is shifting, supply demand balances around. So trying to get a handle on all of that in an increasingly volatile environment, that's what's gotten so hard.
So you said earlier you focus on translating weather and climate risk into grid risk. What does that actually mean in practice?
So it means translating sort of off the shelf, standard or public weather data and weather forecasts into actionable energy forecasts and power market forecasts. That's what it means. And the problem is there's a huge gulf between uh, the public, sort of the default and the public data sets and what we actually need in the power sector. So we're super consumers of weather data, and actually we have needs that are much more intense on the weather side than lots of other industries. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that with the way the grid operates, and um, the way the grid has to be scheduled. So it needs to be in balance 24 hours a day, right? Every minute of the day, we have to match supply and demand. And if we don't, we potentially risk brownouts or blackouts. And that creates a lot of challenges, right? So, for example, one of the first challenges, the sort of like off the shelf, weather data or weather forecasts rarely give you hourly time steps in forecasts, right? So like if you look out, several, even just a few days into the future, traditional weather forecasts move to, 3 hour time steps, 6 hour time steps. That doesn't work for us. It just doesn't. And so right there, you have to start figuring out what happens in between, right? There's issues of spatial resolution. So increasingly, we need to understand how all of these wind and solar farms are operating, right? Well, the weather that drives wind and solar is highly, highly variable over short distances. Think about what happens as you get towards a hilly area or near a ridge top, right? Like we all have seen this. We all know this. Like the wind speeds up as you sort of go over that ridge. Well, that's where we put the wind turbines, right? Well, similarly, you need to have, if you're going to forecast that wind farm, you need to have a weather forecast that is, not telling you sort of this average over, 10 miles or something like that, but it's telling you what's going to happen right there at that ridge top for those wind turbines. So and you can't get that. You can't get that from the off the shelf sort of weather forecasts. Those are challenges. And then, there's another big issue, which, we alluded to, the extremes, right? So in
Right.
in power markets, extreme events have an outsized impact on economics and reliability, right? So here's a stat for you. In ERCOT, a third of the real-time market value comes from just 1% of the hours per year. That's it. So just
Mm.
1% of the hours account for a third of your revenue, essentially, if you're an asset owner. And so trying to understand, what's the sort of the tail events, the P99 and beyond, that's not just like a nice to have. It's critical, or you're missing just a huge chunk of the opportunity and the risk. The traditional weather forecasts, weather data, climate models, even though they're, you might think like that's what these forecasts are for. They're really not. When the difference between sort of what the available data is and our needs in the power sector, again, there's just this big gap between what we think is or what's necessary for us in terms of resolution, in terms of extremes, and what these models can actually do. So that's what sort of the big gaps are that we're filling in.
So it sounds like you're matching two fundamental sets of data, right? You have the very accurate weather data that you need, the very specific weather data that you need, and also the grid fundamentals. What's the demand look like, that sort of thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely, right. It's not enough to just say, oh, it's 100 degrees. That'll be an important event on the power grid for tomorrow or next week or something. Maybe, maybe
Mhm.
not. Depending on the way that resources have changed, the way load growth has changed. Maybe 100 degrees was what was an extreme day, was sort of the threshold for extremes a couple years ago. Maybe now it's 98 degrees or 99 degrees. Maybe the number of 100-degree days that you expected just 5 years ago has changed. And now you expect, twice as many 100-degree days in a particular region. And so you have to understand like how to translate these weather events into extremes. That requires a lot of domain expertise on the grid side. So translating 100 degrees to megawatts to energy, understanding what that load looks like, and doing it at the same time as the renewable picture. So understanding in a very consistent and correlated way, what are the risks of having high or low temperatures combined with weather that reduces renewables, right? So that's been a huge shift in grid modeling. When I started out, all we really cared about was peak demand, right? Weather-based heating and cooling demand. That was the lion's share of our risk, right? In fact, another story that will date me. When I started out, right, the way that you traded ERCOT, super simple. All you need to know three numbers: the daily high temperature at Houston, Dallas, and San Antonio. And that was it. If they were all 100, then it was a buy. The market was going to explode. It's much more complicated now. Now we need to know the simultaneous effect of demand and renewables, because you can have a very, very high demand day with a lot of renewables on the grid, and that can be okay. That can actually be a very loose condition, very mild, very, very low prices. So we've moved from thinking about, just peak demand to peak net demand. So pretty much any power market now you don't just look at load or demand. You look at load and renewables at the same time, and you actually net them. You subtract the renewables from demand. You look at peak net demand. Net demand can look very, very different from just demand. It's more variable. It's obviously affected by wind and solar. It has much more significant ramps in large part because of the solar. Solar turns on very quickly in the morning and it shuts down very quickly in the afternoon. Load is much more gradual. So net demand um, is much more complicated to get control of, and it's driving a lot of the volatility we see.
Gotcha. Well, you all have developed a tool to really help the market. It's something you've called the grid stress index. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what it is and how it helps the power trading community?
Right. So what we were just talking about, right, which is essentially the grid stress these days is driven by not a singular dimension, right? Just kind of heating, cooling demand, but multiple dimensions at the same time. It used to be trader got out of bed, looked at his phone for the weather forecast and the load forecast, right? And just said, "Oh, what's peak load tomorrow or today or something?" And they pretty much could ballpark, is the grid tight? What do the conditions look like? These days, very different. You say, well, what is the weather? What is the load? Well, where's wind generation? Where's solar? Where are outages? All of this at once. The combination, the relative balance of all of these things, that's what determines how stressed the grid is. So we've reduced all of that down into one number that we call the grid stress index. So what it is, it's a ratio of the energy that you need to supply on the grid to the amount of available dispatchable capacity to serve that energy. So the energy that you need to serve on the grid is net demand, it's net load. So you
Right.
take load, subtract out renewables. What you're left with, that's the energy amount that you need to meet with dispatchable generation, thermal generation, gas generation, coal generation, nuclear, these kind of things, right?
Hmm.
And so the ratio of how much energy you have to serve to the amount of capacity that you have to serve it, that ratio is what we call the grid stress index. So our calculation of that, it's really just it's a measure of dispatchable capacity utilization. So the grid stress index looks like a percentage from 0 to essentially 1. You can get a little bit over 1 if you have imports. So it's a measure from 0 to 1. So instead of what I described as oh, let's look at the load, the wind, the solar, the outages, all these things, right? If somebody just told me, oh, here's the picture in ERCOT tomorrow. We've got 60 gigs online, 24 gigs of thermal outages, we've got 15 gigs of wind and 5 gigs of solar. Quick, is the market, tight or loose? I don't know. I'd have to think about it. And now if I just told you GSI is 75%, well, there's a very, very nice and clean relationship between grid stress index and prices in power markets. And I can instantly know, like, oh, that's actually a pretty tight situation. We should watch out for prices. So for example, this just happened this week. So Monday in ERCOT, because we're in outage seasons, there's 30 gigs offline right now in ERCOT. Conditions are, warm, nice. We were just talking to some traders down there. They said, yeah, it's kind of nice right now. It's warm, but it was nice. Load was nothing to write home about. But because the relative combination of, load and outages created conditions where at the end of the day, when the solar flipped offline right at sunset, we had very, very, very tight conditions. Now we saw this GSI spiked, um, and it actually our forecast had it spiking to the highest level in ERCOT since Fern. So since Winter Storm Fern. So ERCOT was as tight as the week of Winter Storm Fern, excuse me, this Monday afternoon. The market didn't see it. We did. And our customers were able to anticipate, like, hey, on balance, like things are going to get really tight in the evening hours, and it led to $1,000 prints.
Gotcha. So you mentioned Winter Storm Fern. Now I'm having trouble with the word too. Winter Storm Fern. And you've touched on how this would help a trader understand uh, the situation a little more differently. Would you like to dive into that a little bit and maybe talk through
Sure.
sort of step by step how, taking that real life scenario, how does your framework really help practically for a trader?
Yeah. So one thing we haven't talked about are sort of some of the details of the, the proprietary weather that we bring to bear to understand risk in power markets. I talked kind of broadly about these concepts that you need.
Mhm.
Oh, you have to understand extremes. Well, how do we do that? So our forecast solution is called Scenario One. Scenario
Okay.
One is a hybrid machine learning statistical large ensemble forecast. So what does that mean? Well, an ensemble forecast is not just one single forecast. Like you look at your phone, it says, oh, tomorrow at 3 p.m., it's going to be 70 degrees. No, an ensemble forecast is a forecast made up of many, many component forecast members. So instead of just one, we actually issue 1,000. We issue 1,000 forecasts. The reason we can do that and the government can't is because they have very, very, computationally intense, slow, physics-based weather forecasts, and we power ours with machine learning. So it's very, very efficient, very fast. So we can actually run 1,000 of these scenarios. And what that does is it shows you the range of risk that you need to anticipate. If all of these, if all of these scenarios, if you will, are very, very tight together, you can be confident there's not a lot of risk. If they're very wide, then you can understand what the tail events are, right? Then you can measure these tails and these risks. You can actually see sort of the 99th percentile and beyond. So if you're in January, the beginning of January, even if sort of the short-term forecast doesn't look very, very extreme, you're looking out into the future. What Scenario One is going to show you are the tail risks. It's going to say, sure, right now, sort of the median expectation might again, not be that interesting, but sort of the P1, temperature scenario, it's still lurking out there and it's very extreme. And when you translate that P1 temperature, scenario and wind and solar to a, net load and a grid stress index and ultimately market prices, then you can see, hey, maybe it's, let's look at this risk, in late January. There's a really, really long tail for prices. There is still the risk of, the last week of January, even though it's trading whatever, it's trading $100 right now. That could easily go. That could easily be, 4 times as high. So it allows you to quantify the risk. It allows you, we call this sort of the risk premium or the fear premium, where forward markets have to take into account the risk of these extremes. It allows you to quantify, not only what you think, sort of the fair value of that risk premium is, but where the market is trading. You can look at the market and you could say, is that a reasonable risk premium for the things that we know are possible but haven't seen yet?
Gotcha. That's really fascinating. I think that's giving a really big advantage to the marketplace by providing that information. So let's look ahead a little bit. We're expecting massive demand growth from AI and data centers. We've got increasingly diverse investment in new generation, which is everything from gas to renewables, nuclear, and an increasingly complex regulatory environment. So what's on your radar in terms of what traders should be watching, and how will this affect how you develop your offerings?
So there is an increasing trend towards more information, especially more granular information. You mentioned data centers, right? Data centers are very large point loads, and understanding where those loads are, what they can be, and how they will affect, regional supply demand balances going forward. It's on everybody's mind, and it fits into this broader theme of more granular information on the grid. So, for example, we just recently announced the launch of a new product, which is asset level generation potential forecast. What that is, unlike traditional renewables forecasts, which forecast sort of the amount of regional or grid wide wind generation and solar generation, we can now forecast every single asset on the grid. So starting with ERCOT, we forecast hourly generation potential for every wind farm, every solar farm, right? A much more granular look at variability that drives particular nodal price spreads and congestion. That kind of intelligence is going to be more and more important as you see more large loads, more data centers. And then I think going forward, sort of the next thing on the horizon that a lot of people are gonna have to start anticipating, and our platform is perfectly designed for, is understanding what the likelihood of extreme events on the grid, like actual grid emergencies, because those events are going to trigger could trigger demand response, right, from a lot of these large loads. So what's happening right now is we're having this debate about, can the how's the grid going to handle and serve these large loads? Well, a lot of kind of the solutions around interconnecting these large loads have to do with flexibility, have to do with saying, well, okay, we'll allow these huge data centers to interconnect to the grid, so long as they can prove that they're flexible, or that in an emergency, actually they're going to be the first to curtail. Well, how do you think about modeling that? Now you've got to know the likelihood of these super tail events, these real extremes, right? You've got to know how long they're going to last, what regions they're going to be in. Um, so I think, again, it just kind of highlights the need for more granular information and more good forecasts about the likelihood of extremes and what they look like. I think that's going to be really, really important for people to wrap their heads around.
I agree, and it's all fascinating stuff, and I think really relevant to a lot of our viewers. So, Rob, thank you so much for being with us today. Again, this is Rob Cirincione from Sunairio, CEO for Sunairio. Rob, if they want to get in touch with you and learn a little bit more about your company and some of the things you offer, what's the best way to reach you?
So go to our website, scenario.com, and or you can send us an email at info@scenario.com.
Wonderful. Well, once again, thank you for joining us, and thank all of you for listening. Once again, I'm Howard Walper with Commodities People. Have a great day.